All right, today we are talking to Brittany Polat. Brittany, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your website?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Yes, my newest project is livinginagrement.com, where I'm looking at kind of delving into psychology, and moral philosophy in the context of Stoicism. So for people who kind of already have an understanding of the basic principles of Stoicism and are kind of interested in going a little bit deeper, this is what I'm trying to look at. How do we actually live a Stoic life in the 21st century? You know, what does it mean? What does it look like? How do we do it? So my site explores these questions.
Yeah, very good. And let me just give a little background to what we're going to be talking about today. So for anybody who's never seen my channel, it's Common Sense Ethics. This is just a quick reminder to subscribe if you like this type of content. And today we're going to be doing a reverse interview. I recently did a guest interview on Brittany's site where we talked about critical thinking, which I think is a really necessary topic in today's world. And Brittany, you have a YouTube channel, but you don't have much content. Is that right? Or do you not have a channel?
I'm thinking about developing a channel, not really so much there yet.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'm really happy to participate in this first interview with you.
Yeah, that's why we're doing it on my channel, because I wasn't sure whether you either didn't have it or you just didn't really have it up and running yet. No problem. But yeah, so we're going to do sort of a reverse format today. Brittany's going to interview me, which is nice because I don't have to do, well, I'll do more talking actually. I'll be more talking than listening today. But sure, so let's get started then.
Okay, yes. So thank you for coming on to livinginagrement.com with that interview. Super interesting. And like you said, critical thinking is essential today. And I feel like it's kind of a buzzword, but it hasn't really been explored as fully as it should. Yeah. And it's of interest to anybody who enjoys philosophy and thinking about life. And it's not completely related to Stoicism. I mean, you can talk about critical thinking outside of Stoicism, but that's my particular focus. And I really see a lot of dovetailing and overlap there. So very much appreciate you bringing up this subject.
Great.
So my first question for you is, obviously one of your primary topics at Common Sense Ethics is critical thinking. So could you just kind of explain what that means to you and why you're interested in it?
Yeah, critical thinking is really multifaceted. I would say there's a lot of parts to it. I think that maybe my definition might even be broader than typically, like what the typical definition of critical thinking would be. But yeah, basically when you're talking about critical thinking, you're referring really strictly to logic, which is the science of how arguments need to be formed in order to be valid or to be correct. But critical thinking really goes pretty far beyond that. It really has to do with, many things, which would also be sort of soft skills, like having appropriate standards for evidence, being able to tell what is true from what is false, being open-minded to a certain extent, which doesn't mean that you're gullible, but, it means that, you are open to new ideas. Not being afraid to be wrong. That's a hard one. I'm still working on that. Changing your mind, which is really similar to not being afraid of being wrong. And also sort of thinking with a degree of detachment or not being overly emotionally connected to your ideas. And also, I would say also a working knowledge of cognitive bias and group dynamics. And I guess I'm interested in critical thinking because I've always been kind of a contrarian. I'm not contrary about everything, or contrary just to be contrary, but yeah, I guess that's enough said. But
yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned being a contrarian because I wonder if it kind of takes that attitude to get into critical thinking. I mean, most people are kind of just go with the flow, right? Just kind of think whatever everyone else around them is thinking. So I wonder how people can actually take the first step and undergo that realization that maybe I should critically question the ideas of the people around me. I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of what the first step is.
I think there's a different impetus for most people. Something will happen and, they'll just, or they'll read something, or, just there's usually a different trigger or impetus to that for most people. I don't know, like, if that's something that can be sort of forced, or I don't know. I mean, well, maybe just sort of talking about it like this, in sort of a open or, charitable way. I don't know. But then I think that probably the trigger point is different for everybody.
I would agree with that. I mean, that's how I became interested in philosophy. I had read a book about philosophy in high school, and it just seemed completely theoretical, dry, and irrelevant to everything. And then as I became an adult and started, looking at some of these complex issues and having to make decisions about what to do with life and looking around at things in the news, then you start to kind of dig a little bit more deeply, I think. So I think you're right. It just is based on your own personal experience.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Socratic method, because you have recently done a couple of videos on that, and I know that's of interest to you. So I really like your definition in a blog post called How to Get Rid of the Need to Be Right. Yeah. You define the Socratic method as a system of cooperative dialogue between individuals based on asking and answering questions, raising doubts, drawing out underlying presumptions. So could you tell us a little bit more about why the Socratic method is so helpful?
It's helpful because it's a dialectical method, which means that you have a thesis and then you discuss it, and then objections, or what's called an antithesis or antithesis, is raised, and then you can come to a synthesis, basically, which is, you can raise doubts about the original premise, or the original assumption. But it doesn't need to be overly complicated. It's basically a way of sort of working together to discover the truth, and it can be really effective, because, at least in everyday type of dialogue, because if you're not worried, about winning the argument per se, although that's how, like, lawyers use it and stuff. They want to win the argument. But if you aren't so much worried about winning the argument and you ask open-ended questions, it can tend to really draw people out rather than, just making statements or really sort of disagreeing with somebody, because people really like to answer questions and give their point of view. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's effective in everyday life.
Okay, so would you tend to use it more like in a formal philosophical setting, like maybe you join a philosophy discussion group, or could that also be used kind of in everyday conversation just with friends and family members?
Both. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just taking a more Socratic approach would be, if someone makes a statement, you could say, oh, really, do you think this, or A, B, or C, or do you think that, this could be a counter, or, well, you might not even want to say that in, everyday conversation, but you could say, well, what about this idea? That's kind of contradicts the other idea, or what do you think about this? Or, just asking more questions rather than making more statements.
Right.
I don't always do that. It definitely is a learned skill. The appropriate, both the method and the appropriate attitude behind it that you bring to it.
Right. That's what I was going to pick up on, because that's kind of the most crucial piece, is that openness of attitude, right? Not approaching it as I'm right and I'm going to prove this to you, but really having that spirit of open inquiry. Let's explore this concept together. We all want to find the truth, kind of starting with that assumption. Everybody wants to find the truth. How do we do this? Let's work as a team to do it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Theoretically, everybody wants to find the truth. I don't know about that, but...
Right. So that could be an issue if your conversation partner doesn't kind of reciprocate with that spirit, right?
Yeah.
So that could be one potential challenge. And so earlier you had mentioned cognitive biases, and I think this is super important, whether you're doing Socratic dialogue or just being aware of your own cognitive biases. So could you tell us a little bit more about that? What are cognitive biases and which ones should we be looking out for?
Right. A cognitive bias is basically anything, I guess, that the brain is predisposed to do, kind of, that can affect your thought process. I don't know if that's a good definition. There's a lot of them, probably like, upwards of 50 that I think. I don't know. That's just off the top of my head. But one of the ones that really tends to sort of affect critical thinking a lot is confirmation bias. And what that means is that we have confirmation bias for a good reason, and that's because when we go through life, we we need to have some, pattern recognition and conceptual frameworks that help us navigate life, based on things that have happened in the past or whatever. So that's the reason that we have, cognitive bias, or confirmation bias. But the problem is it really can be a detriment to critical thinking, because it means that we already tend to favor our own conclusions. We favor the things that we already think. Basically everybody has this tendency, to think that, oh, I already know the answer to that, or, and so forth.
You had also mentioned, I think, the dunning-krueger effect. Can you describe that?
That is a little bit less relevant to critical thinking, or it can be, but it just sort of means that, people who have a lower skill set in some area, or tend to think that they know more about it than they do, and then paradoxically, people who've gained the most mastery in a certain area tend to think, or that they tend to be more humble about their opinion. Yeah, it doesn't always apply to everything, but it's interesting, and it's kind of paradoxical.
So, like the old saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
It makes you overconfident and think that you're more capable of parsing information than you actually are.
Correct. Right.
Okay. Well, that's good to be on the lookout for as well. Let's talk about nuance as well, because I really like your thoughts on this. You say that a lot of the issues that society is facing today are falsely presented in very simplistic terms. Yeah. When in fact they're incredibly complex and nuanced, and that our conversation today is really lacking on that nuance. So can you talk about that? How does it harm us? And is there anything we can do to reintroduce nuance into the conversation?
I think I had a difficult time answering that, because I think that, I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that, but Part of the problem with lack of nuance is that people tend to lead really busy lives, and there's all this information thrown at us, and if you think about most news or anything like that in general, it's really very headline driven. There's just not time to examine things, especially with really complex public issues or things like that. There's just not time to really examine them in detail. Even journalists have tight deadlines. Most people are digesting such a vast amount of information on a regular basis that they don't really have time to think about it in detail. And to really explore something, you really need to first educate yourself about it, which would require a lot of time to go through multiple sources and things like that. And then when you discuss it, you would really have to, take a lot of time. And it's just, most people, that's very low, and probably with good reason, to some extent. That's very low on people's priority list. People have so much to deal with, especially now with everything else that's going on. It puts even more stress on, people in terms of time and other things that they have going on that's occupying their mental energy. So in terms of reintroducing nuance, I'm not very optimistic about that. So I don't know how that could be done. One thing I mentioned though in the interview was that there was a philosopher named Terence Hoyt who thought that he thought that there should be more philosophers in public service. I don't know if that would help because, many philosophers are, like I said, are just as intellectually rigid as the next person, and as partisan as the next person. And that doesn't really help things. But I did mention that I think, though, I wish that there wouldn't be a rush to solve everything through legislation. I really feel like there's so much every time anything goes wrong, people always desire to solve it through, more legislation, and that can sometimes create unintended consequences. You often hear about there'll be a bill that's 1,000 pages thick that's introduced. No one has time to read what's even in it, and then it's voted on, and there's all kinds of things in it that no one has really taken the time to sort through, the details or how this will practically affect things, or, it's just crazy. But Go on.
So it sounds like a lot of what you're saying boils down to just the lack of nuance as a reaction to the complexity of our world, the
Yeah.
complexity of the modern world, and then with the
Yeah.
pandemic, and there's just so much information coming at people. The
Right.
knee-jerk reaction is to just simplify as much
Yeah.
as possible. And maybe
Yeah.
it's necessary to do that because of the vast amount of information we have to process.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you said you're not very optimistic about solving this problem. I'm wondering, I mean, I don't think there's any chance of the world getting less complex anytime soon. It seems to be going in the direction of more complexity. So, yeah, I wonder if there's anything that can be done. We're taking mental shortcuts, basically. Our brain is kind of just going to the easiest solution as a reaction to all this complexity.
Yeah.
Tricky, very tricky. Obviously, you and I
Yeah.
are not going to solve it in this one conversation.
No.
Well, you've mentioned a couple times in the interview the need for humility, especially intellectual humility. And I think also that goes hand in hand with curiosity, because when you're curious about the world, it leads you to continually inquire into it. And that leads you to understand how much you don't know yet. So I think curiosity and intellectual humility kind of go together. So could you say a little bit more about how those two are necessary for critical thinking and maybe how they make us better, just as better human beings as well?
Right. I think both of those could be lumped together into something that I've discussed, which is actually a guy. There's a guy who came on my channel who his website is socraticmethod.net. His name is Maxwell. But yeah, it was he coined this idea. He coined this term, but he calls it Socratic Temperament. And that would really encompass both of those things that you're talking about, which would be sort of curiosity and humility and sort of the desire to learn, and then also sort of, a certain amount of humility in that process, in terms of thinking and speaking or teaching.
So it seems like this is something that is also missing from our contemporary discourse.
Yeah,
So
very much so.
So maybe we as individuals taking the first step just towards reintroducing nuance and this Socratic temperament. I mean, maybe it starts at the individual level and kind of work our way up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's all you can do, right?
That's all most of us can do, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we move for a minute to the relationship between Stoicism and critical thinking? Because I do think there is a relationship there. And one thing that you talk about is how controlling your emotions or managing your emotions properly can actually help you become a better critical thinker. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, Stoicism really considers, I guess, emotions like anger to be toxic or to be passions. They consider to be. I'm not totally sure I agree 100% with that, but it is very valuable for critical thinking, because if you're angry, right, you're not going to consider anybody else's point of view. You're not going to make your own points as well. You're not going to be open to, meeting someone halfway. So all those things are really good. All that skill, being able to sort of, I like to call it sort of thinking with emotional distance, or, being able to, there's a lot of different things you could probably call that, but, and that's really closely related to Stoicism and very helpful for critical thinking.
And I think earlier you also mentioned kind of distancing yourself from your ego, putting distance between your ego and your opinions, so that if someone is criticizing your opinions or wants to discuss those opinions with you, it's not an attack on yourself.
Yeah.
Just a discussion rather than an ego attack, right?
You're not saying, oh, you're saying I'm wrong, and, no, I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm saying this idea has, A, B, and C thing wrong with it, or whatever. Yeah, that's very difficult to do when sort of emotions are running high. Maybe all of us have had an experience with that this year. There's so much more to disagree with people about now, between sort of people's opinions about the pandemic or about politics. It's just a complete nightmare. So if you can master that skill, it's very helpful.
Yeah, I definitely see that. Do you see, in general, a relationship between Stoicism and critical thinking? that maybe people who are Stoics, that they could kind of leave here and start putting into practice easily?
Well, beyond what we've already talked about, I think it probably requires a bit more study to do that, because one of the sort of limitations of the modern Stoicism movement that does not include traditional Stoicism, which is also modern because we're all modern Stoics, but is that a lot of people who are interested in Stoicism are only interested in the ethics, or only looking at the ethics. And whereas ancient Stoics it was a holistic system, right? It would have been, you would have looked at ethics, but you would have also studied logic, both Aristotelian and Stoic logic. The Stoics had their own logic, most of which has been lost. We don't know everything about Stoic logic per se, but they would have also studied physics or metaphysics. So, I mean, yeah, there's if the traditional Stoic movement, whatever you want to call it, the people who run College of Stoic Philosophers, they actually offer a course in the ethics. They have a separate course on ethics, a separate course on logic, and a separate course on metaphysics. And I've done I didn't finish it, but I did do the logic and the metaphysics course that they offer. It's really very interesting. They do it in their free time. To sort of educate people. And I would think if even if you don't necessarily accept the Stoic metaphysics, if you're interested in Stoicism in a serious way, I would really recommend that people either learn it on their own or do the course like I did, because that will familiarize you with logic, which indirectly will also make you a better critical thinker. But in addition to that, there's sort of the soft skills that I mentioned before that really are not all related to virtue or to Stoicism, like group dynamics, which we haven't touched on, things like groupthink and things like, and other things that really are not quite as related to Stoicism. But yeah, there's also soft skills that you really can develop on your own, whether you are Stoic or not, or whether you're studying, logic or not. Like some of the things that we've talked about today, but that make you a better critical thinker.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation.
Yeah.
I also think there's some overlap. I mean, to me, one of the things Stoicism does is it helps you to see the world clearly. Mm-hmm. Again, distancing yourself from your ego, taking that broader view, even exercises that are famous, like the view from above. I think what they're really trying to do is get rid of all your assumptions that you've had, all your thoughtless assumptions and habits, push those aside. Yeah. Okay, now let's see the world how it really is. I'm not the center of the world, right? Today we have billions of people on the planet. So let's look at things clearly. And once you start to do that, you can think critically about things because you're not so attached to them. You're not attached to material goods or externals, right? Yeah. So I think there's a lot of overlap in that way as well.
Very true. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about recommendations for people who want to investigate this further. Are there any particular books that you would recommend?
Well, I can put in a link to my website with the books for some of those books that I recommend for older teens are actually good for adults too. So I can link to that. A lot of them have to do with, rhetoric and with, like logical fallacies and other things. Wasn't really well prepared for that question.
Oh, sorry.
There are a lot of courses and books for adults, for the critical thinking and course-related material. There's also a book that's not strictly about critical thinking, but it's called, I forget what it's called. I think it's called The Well-Educated Mind. Giving yourself the classical education that you never had, or something like that. Because like a classical education would focus on partly on the trivium of sort of logic, rhetoric, and grammar, right? Which are the three parts of thought that are, the three skills that are really necessary for critical thinking. But there's a book like that for adults, which it sort of has to do with reading the great books, the classics of Western literature, and then thinking about them, critically. I'm sure there's lots of other things that we could that we could, do you have any recommendations off the top of your head? Have you looked into it?
Oh, no, I am not an expert on this critical thinking.
Neither am I.
We can definitely link to, so I guess you're referring to the article you wrote for my other blog, A Parent Stoic, where you recommended books to jumpstart critical thinking, and you have different age categories for different age groups from children through teenagers.
Yeah.
So the ones for older teens probably would be appropriate for adults
they definitely would be. In fact, one of them actually, I think I had to read for, like I mentioned that College of Stoic Philosophers course. There was one, I don't remember which one it was offhand, but I can link to it. I don't think it was Rhetoric Alive. I don't know which one it was, but one of them I actually read for that course that I did, the logic course.
Okay. Yeah. And we've touched a little bit on education here with the trivium. For parents who are watching, do you have any suggestions, maybe things that you do with your kids to help them? Of course, they're still very young,
mine are young,
but I think there are things we can do just kind of in the course of daily life to kind of prepare them for that eventually when they're older.
Well, just sort of when you just not being dogmatic when you discuss things. You know, like when your children ask questions, you could say something and then say, well, what do you, on an age-appropriate level, say, well, what do you think about this? Or, do you think that... I mean, of course, then it totally depends on the child's age, because, like, young children aren't capable of abstract thought. So they can't do true critical thinking. That skill doesn't develop really until later, until maybe... the tween years, probably. But what types of things do you do? Because your children are slightly older than mine.
Yeah, my oldest is 8. So I have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And I really see the progress because, like you said, not being dogmatic and kind of asking kids, because obviously they're full of questions. Yeah. They ask why all the time. They try out new ideas. What if I did this? Yeah. What if I said this? They test their limits, They're doing this all the time naturally. Yeah. So I feel like our response as a parent to that, can kind of set them in one direction or another. So if you don't answer their questions and just say, because that's the way it is, or if you're a parent who says, because I said so, that kind of shuts down the conversation between you and them and stifles maybe their curiosity that they bring to the world. So I think we can definitely cultivate that based on our responses to them, just the natural curiosity and wonder they bring to the world, and help them cultivate that. Oh yeah, that's a good observation. Why do you think that might be? Or I don't know the answer to that. Let's find out. And of course we all have our phone. We can Google things now, right? Yeah. So yes, kind of building that attitude, that openness to inquiry and that curiosity. I think you can do that at any age. You can kind of foster that. So I hope, that's going to pay off dividends later on and raise, true critical thinkers.
Yeah, that's a really good response. That's probably better than anything I could have said. But my son sometimes asks metaphysical questions that I can't answer or that I don't know the answer to. So.
Yes.
Sometimes I say, I don't really know, buddy. I say some people think this or some people think that, or, so on. But I guess that it does, if it depends what they're asking, but if you sort of try to show a certain humility or, make it clear that even you don't have all the answers.
I think, that's so important. That's a great example, like metaphysical questions. I mean, there's no one answer, right? So, and sometimes I've told my daughter, well, we're going to have to think about that for a while. You don't have to make a decision right now. You can think about it and maybe decide that when you're older, right? So, but just showing that kind of Socratic temperament that we've been talking about during this interview. So I think that's a good note to end on. Go forth and be Socratic, right?
Yeah, very good. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Is there anything else you'd like us to know about your website, or do you want to plug your site again, or anything else you'd like us to know before we wrap up?
Nope. I mean, I'm always available for questions. I'm on Twitter as well, so I'd encourage anyone to reach out if you have comments or suggestions, or just want to talk some more about any of these topics. I'm happy to talk with you.
Okay, very good, Brittany. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Take care.